from him. Last week we dealt with the vocation and the calling of Caspian, as you remember. And now we look at how your story matters. And we're going to look at several things here. But before we do, the first thing, since some of you are eating donuts, we need to look at the presence of food in Narnia again in this book. You remember, once the children have boarded the ship, they're given spiced wine to warm them. Eustace complains, and he is a glutton in the way that Lewis sees a glutton, not as someone who eats too much, but is very persnickety about what he or she eats. The worst kind of glutton is the one that says, no, I don't take that kind of mustard. This is what I want. This, he says, is the worst kind of glutton, and they don't even see that as glutton, but it's partly pride and glutton. And Eustace is one of these. He wants distilled water and Plumptree's vitamin nerve food. He is kind of an extreme kind of food addict there. But the ship is filled with sacks of flour, casks of water and beer, barrels of pork, jars of honey, skin bottles of wine, apples, nuts, cheeses, biscuits, turnips, side of bacon, and from the roof hung hams and strings of onions. And all this wonderful food you can begin to kind of smell on board. Now the magician talks about Aslan's time, and his time, he says, all hungry times are 1 o'clock. Now sometimes when we're sitting in church at 10, we think it should be 10 o'clock. But for Lewis, his father believed that 1 o'clock was the hungry time. So he kind of snuck this idea in, that 1 o'clock, whenever it's 1 o'clock, it's time to eat. Aslan's table at the end is where anyone who is hungry can be nourished forever. And that symbolizes what? The Eucharist. Aslan's table is the Eucharist. And here is where this great banquet is. And never did Narnia see such a great banquet. It is laid about with turkey, salmon, lobster, ice puddings and pies, pomegranates, peaches, grapes, and pineapples. The whole promise of happiness is given at the meal where so much food is laid out. And the food is renewed every day. What does that remind us of? Manna for the children of Israel through the wilderness. How manna is given, and you can never store it. You can never keep it. Now, I don't know how many of you freeze food for longer than 3 weeks, but you need something fresh every day, Lewis would say. Then finally, there's the very simple meal at the end, the holy meal of fish that the lamb serves on the beach. And you see, Lewis again is going back to the Gospels and saying, remember how Jesus came after the resurrection, met with the disciples and said, let's have a fish fry. Let's get together and eat the fish. Now, in the writing of this, Lewis confessed that The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is probably the easiest of all the books he wrote. He just sat down and he wrote it through. And he says it's a lot of little episodes, but they really kind of follow. They're like strings on a bead, beads on a string, and you just kind of see them all kind of sparkle their own little way. There are 3 themes we're going to look at today: the adventures, the dreams, and the desires. For Lewis, the adventures is the quest of a search. There is something we need to find. And he goes back to his kind of medieval days of saying, he's a medieval scholar, and the knights would always set out on a quest, an adventure. You remember King Arthur and his knights, and Parzival, and everyone, they're trying to find what? The Holy Grail. And so you have this quest. Now, these adventures are motivated by Caspian's coronation. And at his coronation, he gives an oath that he swore once peace was established in Narnia, he would sail east for a year and a day to find his father's friends or learn of their deaths and avenge them. You remember his evil uncle Miraz had sent off 7 noble lords who were friends of Caspian's fathers to look for treasures just to get them out of the way. Notice, though, too, how Lewis complicates the nature of friends. Think of your best friends and think of the friends that are devoted to you. What we find out is they don't turn out to be good. All of us are bad friends, but you love them. You're devoted to them because when you see the sin in your friends, you see it in yourself. And you realize they will be affectionate to you even as you are faithful to them. Everyone contains their own flaws and foibles along the island. And we hop from island to island, and that's why you have maps in front of you. So you can see how long the lecture is going to go and how much longer it's going to take until we get to the end, okay? I've always loved maps. As a boy, I wanted to be the navigator on trips, and I wanted to find the azimuths on field exercises to find out kind of where our bearing was, all of those kinds of things. If you remember in Prince Caspian, here's where Lewis has sometimes been called kind of a chauvinist. He is not really, because as we'll see, if you look at the women in Narnia, they are some of the brightest and best leaders of everyone. And Edmund mocks Lucy in Prince Caspian. He says, that's the worst thing about girls. They can never carry a map in their heads. To which Lucy retorts, that's because our heads have something inside them. It's easy to carry a map when you're vacant up there. Now, the idea of a journey is rooted in a very extensive literary tradition. We all know the voyages of the Odyssey, the Aeneid, or the journey of Jason and the Argonauts, and there are more parallels too with kind of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels in this. Many literary allusions throughout this one. But it's almost more like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales than John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Fortunately, as Episcopalians, we're right between the Roman Catholic and the Protestant. The Protestant and the Puritan and the Presbyterian, they're the ones who have the solitary pilgrim. They go through their journey alone. Chaucer, on the other hand, has a group of pilgrims. You've got the wife of Bat, you've got the knight, the nun, priest, and all of these characters who all tell their own stories. And so we have all of these stories together that is there. But the key story that is the model for this book is a modern Imram. An Imram is a Celtic voyage. It has episodic moments. There are many German and Celtic legends with voyages. And the most famous is an Irish one that Lewis probably learned at his nurse's knee called St. Brendan's Journey to the Isle of the Blessed. And we follow St. Brendan along. Now, St. Brendan is called the Navigator, and he writes about his holy navigation to the land of promise. And we find that he records in this great work that he has left for us, and he was a real person. He talks about the pastoral animal of island of sheep. He talks about encountering giant crystal towers in the sea, which are icebergs, which sunk the Titanic, which made the worst movie in the world. That's just off on the side, I don't know why. Then he finds flaming mountains, possibly volcanic islands of Iceland. He's chased by a sea creature. A magnificent bird flies and drops a bough of grapes the size of apples among all of his fellow sailors. And what is interesting, we'll find this later on, he finds a hermit clinging to a rock in the middle of the ocean. And his story is that this is Judas, who is on a vacation from hell. But his life is miserable, and he's talking about how horrible things are and to kind of flee from there. And so we find these kind of little elements that are going to pop up later on in the story. So here we have the quest to find the 7 lost lords of Narnia. Now, in the beginning, we find that Lucy and Edmund and Eustace are looking at this kind of picture on the wall when all of a sudden they find themselves in the picture. And it's kind of a reference to the kind of the Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which we're going to see popping in and out throughout this story as well. There are other literary references that you probably caught very easily. Androcles and the lion. Remember the story of Androcles and the lion when the lion comes and has a paw, and a thorn in its paw, and Androcles takes it out and becomes a friend. The same thing will happen with the dragon, and Lucy's the one that remembers that story. So there are 9, maybe 10 adventures as we go through. The first one they come to are the Lone Islands. And Caspian wants to stretch his legs, and Lucy wants to run across the heather. Caspian says to his crew, I tell you what, why don't we go ashore in the boat and send it back, and then we can rock across and let the Dawn Treader pick us up on the other side. Then Lewis notes in an aside that if Caspian had been experienced then, as he became later on in this voyage, he would not have made this suggestion. But at the moment, it seemed excellent. With this aside, Lewis prepares us for a double shot. First, we see the immediate adventure that's going to happen to them, and second, there is an ominous note foreshadowing what is coming on the island. We recognize that Caspian will become wise through these adventures. What do they discover on the island? The slave trade. And he has to kind of encounter that. Now, Eustace is a sulky little thing. Think of the worst little brat you've ever had in a Sunday school class or as a neighbor. They can't even sell him as a slave. They begin to call him useless, Eustace. In fact, the first line of the book is one of the most important ones because it says something about how Lewis identifies with Eustace. The line is, "There was a boy whose name was Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it." What is Lewis's name? Clive Staples Lewis, and he almost deserved it. And that's why from his earliest days he said, "Call me Jack, because my name is more like Eustace Clarence Scrubb's." Now, when liberation finally comes to this island, they find Lord Byrne, who has established roots. And Lewis offers a dig at certain Anglican clergy when he speaks of the governor of the island. What about this governor, this Gumpus? What is he like, says Caspian? Does he still acknowledge the king of Narnia for his lord? Well, he has a perfunctory acknowledgement of Narnia, but he does not live like it. But he would not like it if the king actually came. He would not be pleased to find a real king of Narnia coming upon him. And this is a warning about a real king in our own lives, that there are many who are in the church who do not acknowledge the king and want to live their own lives. I think the most recent example we had was last year when Pope Francis confronted the Archbishop of Germany, who was just building a luxurious mansion for himself. And he said, "No, this is wrong. What you are doing is not what the gospel is about." And so Caspian confronts this governor who thinks he's in charge, but he's not. He also develops this whole kind of slave trade that is there. At the end, the slave trade is stopped, and Lord Byrne is made the new governor of the island. The second adventure is really quick. It's a storm at sea. If you have ever had a sea voyage, and there's always an obligatory storm, the voyage is inadequate. Even John Wesley, on his way to Georgia to set up his missionary venture here down in Georgia, had a storm, and it disturbed him. He was afraid. He began to doubt his salvation. And John Wesley, if it had not been for the Moravians who prayed and sang and rejoiced during the storm, John Wesley would have never have really discovered his inner warmth that is there. Of course, if you are on a carnival cruise, a storm is to be preferred over a sewage disaster. Now, after the storm, they land on Dragon Island, the place of death of Lord Octavian. And this offers one of the most imaginative and powerful of images Lewis conveys to us. This is the story of Eustace, and you remember it. Here is where everybody's story matters. For Lewis, everybody's story matters. Sometimes we are only concerned with our own story or the stories of our children or the stories of people we love. But what Lewis is saying, that everyone, even the most obnoxious people, their stories matter. And those stories have an impact on us. And so we find that Eustace becomes a dragon. Now remember last week we talked about George MacDonald's story where Curdy could go up to people and take their hands and tell what kind of animal they were becoming. We saw that some became eagles or swans or does. Others became weasels and toads and lawyers. Okay, now, okay. People are becoming something. All of us are becoming something. And Eustace, because of his greed, becomes a dragon. And one of the most dramatic moments is when he tries to convert, when he wants to be undragoned. And you remember what he does. He tries to peel off his skin, layer by layer. And as he peels off his skin, he thinks, well, there's a nice new body. Now I'm a good person. But all of a sudden, he looks down and he still has these knobbly dragon feet. He has not changed himself. And Lewis says, no man or woman knows how sinful they are until they try to be good. The closer you are to recognizing your sin, the closer you are to God. We think, yes, I can be good. I can change my behavior. I can change my addiction or my sin. But no. You need Aslan to come, and he comes, and with his nails, his claws, he rips open Eustace, and it hurts. This whole process of conversion hurts. He is the divine surgeon, and to do surgery, you have to cut in and hurt. He comes in, and he sees Aslan, and Aslan changes his life. So we have the story of Eustace's conversion. And Lewis writes, it would be nice and fairly nearly true to say that from that time forth, Eustace was a different boy. He had relapses. There were still many days when he could be very tiresome. But most of those I shall not notice. The cure had begun. Conversion does not change us immediately. It is a long process that even awaits paradise. Lewis says pain is important to us because God speaks to us in our conscience. Our conscience, like Pinocchio, gives this conversation back and forth. God whispers to us in our pleasure. When something good is happening, when we're sitting with each other and we're eating and we're drinking and we're talking, God is whispering to us and saying, look how blessed you are. Be thankful, rejoice. But God shouts to us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to wake us up. That is why at funerals, most of us are more sensitive to what God is doing in life, and people want to hear about a hope that is beyond there. I did go to a funeral this last week, I don't know if I told you, and they sang one of the strangest songs. There was a duet up there, and they sang a song called Wish You Were Here. And I thought, is this basically saying, wish you were dead with me? Because the person who had died, they wanted us to kind of be with them. And it was a very bizarre thing. Nevertheless, we'll move on. The next adventure is a sea serpent. There is an escape and a thrilling adventure, something like meeting one of the great creatures of the sea, Leviathan, Moby Dick, Jaws. It comes from beneath the sea, this great adventure, and they have to cooperate. All of these people. In the Middle Ages, a ship was seen as a metaphor for the church. And the church has to work together. You have the nave of the church. You have the ship of fools, which is all of the sinners together. But unless the body works together, the ship will be destroyed. Then we have Deathwater Island. And here is both kind of a psychological and a moral truth. They come to a pool on the island that turns anything it touches into gold. What myth does this remind us of? Good. King Midas and his golden touch. And that strange magic where when you touch, even the toxic waters are turned to gold. They're as heavy as lead. Everything turns. Anyone's sword would become a gold sword. Anyone's finger could become a gold finger. He's the man with the Midas touch, a spider's touch. Such a cold finger beckons you to enter his web of sin, but don't go in. Thank you, Shirley Bassey. Okay? We go back to James Bond, okay, there. But is that whole theme of James Bond, Goldfinger, is that kind of greed will take us down and ruin us. Then one of my favorite adventures is the Island of the Voice, where you have the silly, invisible Dufflepuds, with the chief voice telling her what to do, Lucy to do, and all the others saying, that's right, that's right. Now, the idea of these Dufflepods probably came from Augustine's City of God or Pliny's Natural History. There are creatures with one foot, and they jump around and say stupid things. These are basically the Three Stooges of Narnia. Okay, they're just really idiots, all of them. They come right out of British music halls. They are under a spell to be invisible until Lucy can go up and read a book of magic and take off their spell of being invisible. But on the island, when Lucy goes to the house to read the cure from the magician's book, she dreams. And the dreams begin to happen that all of these kinds of dreams come out of the book. When she finds it, she opens up the heavy tome so that you can not turn back the pages. There's no title pages, but the spells begin right away. At first, there's nothing important in any of these spells. There are cures for warts, for cramps, for washing your hands in moonlight in a silver basin. There are cures for toothaches, and Lewis hated toothaches. One of the worst pains on earth for him was a toothache. He would rather go through anything else, but toothaches were there. And he found a cure for toothaches in here. She reads all kinds of spells, from how to find buried treasure, how to remember things forgotten, how to forget things you want to forget, how to tell if someone is telling the truth, or how to give a man an ass's head, which takes us back to Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream that we see there. This was one of Lewis's favorite jokes, which was really bad, but he still told it over and over again, particularly when they drank a lot. But it was about an Anglican bishop who had attended a performance of the Midsummer Night's Dream at an all-girls school. And so all the parts from bottom to everyone else was played by a girl. And after the play, the bishop got up to commend the female players, saying, This is the first time I've seen a female bottom. Okay, no, Bishop. Lewis was never a good stand-up comedian, and I can't do it either. Now, you can also find out what others say about you. And this is a frightful thing, which is not a pretty picture. So Lucy asked to hear what her friends are whispering about her. And the thing is, they are not saying very nice things. The great thing about this is that if you go to Ecclesiastes, it tells us, do not worry if your servant curses you behind your back. Because the next verse says, because you do the same thing to everybody else. All of us gossip and talk about others. And Lewis is showing the kind of democracy of this, of how we need to watch our words that are there. And then the one spell that really tempts her is how to make yourself the most beautiful woman in the world. And this allusion, of course, is to Helen of Troy, and she wants to be like Susan, and you see the jealousy there. And as she goes through this whole process, and she sees herself in the book, and she almost comes face to face with herself, and just at the last moment, Aslan's face comes up and confronts her, and it just shocks her into reality. Finally, she speaks the spell of how to make all things visible. And the duffel pods become visible, they're happy, they bounce around like toy balloons, but she also sees Aslan standing there, and she says, "Oh, Aslan, it was very kind of you to come." And Aslan answers, "I have been here all the time, but only now have you made me visible." It's one of the great truths where Lewis talks about Emmanuel, that God is with us and we do not see him. But he is there continually comforting and resting and leading. And so Lewis is trying to remind us that even though we cannot see the hand of God, God's hand is at work in our lives. The next is the dark island. This is the eeriest and the scariest of all. And it starts with Edmund and Lucy, they had daydreamed before, but now they're here on the boat and they come to this dark realm. And in the dark realm, they're coming along, and it's very much taken from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You can see Lewis would have these kind of stories beside him and say, I can steal this. This works right in here. Anyway, you find on this island a dark, shrill voice crying, "Mercy! Mercy! If you only hear one more dream, have mercy. Take me on board. Take me even if you strike me dead. But in the name of all mercies, do not fade away and leave me in this horrible land." "Where are you?" shouted Caspian. "Come aboard. Welcome." Edmund thought he had never seen a wilder man. Thought he did not look very old. Though he did not look very old, his hair was an untidy mop of white. His face was thin and drawn. And for clothing, he only had a few wet rags hung around him. But what one noticed more than anything else were his eyes, which were so widely open that he seemed to have no eyelids. And he stared as if in agony or pure fear. The moment his feet reached the deck, he said, "Fly, fly, aboard with your ship, about with it, row, 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 row as if your life depend upon it from this cursed shore." "Compose yourself," said all the people, Caspian. "We are not used to flying or retreating." The stranger stared horribly at the voice of Reepicheep, the mouse. And he goes, "What is this?" A talking mouse. "But nevertheless, you will fly from here. This is the island," he said, "where dreams come true." And one of the sailors said, "That's the island I've been looking for all my life. Maybe Nancy will finally marry me. Maybe Blair will marry me and sit beside me. It's a wonderful dream." And another says, "Maybe I'll find Tom again. Tom, my friend who has died, maybe he'll be back." "And no," says the man, "no, fools," stamping his foot. "That's the sort of talk that brought me here, and I'd rather have been drowned or never born. Do you not hear what I say? This is where dreams, do you understand? Not daydreams, but dreams come true." There was about a half a minute of silence, and then with great clatter of armor, the whole crew were tumbling down the main hatch as quick as they could and flinging themselves on the oars to row as they never had before. "We'll never get out, we'll never get out." They turned quickly and they rowed, and suddenly everyone starts hearing something very different in the darkness. Everyone hears his or her own fear. There's like a huge pair of scissors opening and shutting. Something crawling up the side of the ship. Gongs begin. Fear that they will never get out. Lucy prays to Aslan and says, "If you ever love us at all, send us help now." And in the darkness, a tiny speck of light appears, and suddenly an albatross circles the mast. Exhausted and shaking, they emerge from the darkness of their dreams and their nightmares, and they leave. All of these night fears Lewis knew, and he began to kind of say children are having night fears, and to recognize them and to kind of deal with them. Then comes the most charming story, Aslan's Table, where they find all this kind of, the three lords are enchanted, and they have kind of beards that are like bird nests or haystacks. They're so huge. And a great lady comes up whose name is Ramadou. And Ramadou is kind of the story from Sleeping Beauty, and it's wonderful because Caspian has fallen in love with Ramadou, a star, as soon as he has seen her. And he is just so enamored. And he says, well, do you know that when you have these kind of people under a spell of sleep, that there's a story in the world that Lucy and Edmund come from that says when all the people are sleeping, a prince can come and kiss the princess and it will dissolve the enchantment. So here he's trying to come on and say, listen, let me kiss you and we'll be okay. These guys will wake up. And she says, well, here it is different. Another woman taking charge. Here he cannot kiss the princess until he has dissolved the enchantment. Women should always be in charge of men. Okay? My daughter's boyfriend just broke up with her. Okay? And so that's what I've told her. I said, that's okay. This is a good thing. What you do now is you dismiss him completely and say, there is no more enchantment here. I'm moving on. There are lessons here that he gives for this kind of relationship. And so Caspian, having heard that he cannot kiss the princess until he has dissolved the enchantment, begins to say, then in the name of Aslan, show me how to set about this task. I want to be able to kiss you really soon. And so this wonderfully kind of brilliant woman controls the king, and as you know, at the end, they do get married. Then finally, there is the sea and the beginning of the end of the world. Here is where they have gone to the utter east, and the utter east is this beautiful place. And there's a word for it that Lewis uses called Sehnsucht. Sehnsucht is a German term which means longing, a desire. It's something that haunts you because there is something that is going to make you happy and right and good, but it's always out of your reach. It's though a glimpse is on the side there. It's very much like St. Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest in the Lord. And so here's this Sehnsucht, which takes little Reepicheep, all of his desires. From his birth, he said, there was a prophecy over me. When I was a cradle, a woodwoman, a dryad spoke this verse over me. Where the sky and water meet, where the waves go sweet, do not doubt, Reepicheep, to find all that you seek. There is the utter east. I do not know what it all means, but the spell of it has been on my life forever. And so he follows with his little boat, his little coracle, this little wicker boat, and he sets his nose to the east and he goes into Aslan's country. And it's really a beautiful way of looking at death, because death invites us to this kind of bountiful place that we know for which we were made. We are strangers in this world, but not in that one. And then at the end, we find that Aslan comes as the lamb, and he sees Lucy and Edmund, and he begins and says, come and have breakfast. And Lucy says, please, Aslan, before we go, will you tell us when we can come back to Narnia again? Please. And oh, do, make it soon. Dearest, says Aslan very gently, you and your brother will never come back to Narnia. Oh, Aslan, said Edmund and Lucy both together in despairing voices. You are too old, children, and you must now come close to your own world now. But it isn't Narnia, you know, sobbed Lucy. It's you. We shan't meet you there. How can we live never meeting you? But you shall meet me, dear one, said Aslan. Are you there too, sir? Said Edmund. I am. But there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason why you were brought into Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little while, you may know me better there. For Lewis, this is the reason we go into Narnia. It is simply a sign to say, go back into your world and know that I am there and that I am calling you. I close with one story about an old seminary professor of mine who was in his office one day, and he was sitting there quietly getting all of his work done, and suddenly there was a knock on the door. Hey, Mel, it's Jack. It's coffee time. It's 1 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Hey, Jack, it's good to see you. I've got some papers to grade for afternoon class. I can't really do anything now. How about later today? Mel, it's 1 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Jack, please, let me get the papers done and we'll go tomorrow, a whole dinner. Mel, it's 1 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. So Mel knew he couldn't get rid of Jack, so he said, okay. So he went and they had 10 minutes of coffee and he came back to his office. The next afternoon, Mel, it's 1 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Hey, that was funny yesterday. I've got a report for the president. I've got to get done. These financials need to be done. Mel, it's 1 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Please, Jack, please. I've got to finish this. Mel, it's 1 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. So Mel went again with Jack and they had coffee. And this went on for the next 3.5 weeks. Every afternoon. Mel, it's 1 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Mel would go off to coffee. On Friday of the 4th week, there was no knock. Mel looked at his watch, 1 o'clock, ran down the hall to Jack's office. He threw open the door, and there was Jack with his arms wide open and said, I knew you'd come. Every day, God comes to us and says, it's time for coffee. It's time to sit with me. And this is what Aslan is showing the children, that I am there with you. You do not realize how you need me, but I am always there to come and have coffee with you. May the Lord bless each one of you and take us to the silver chair next week. Thanks.